Hey everyone, welcome to AI Innovation in Veterinary Medicine. Today we have Dr. Jonathan Lustgarten here with us. Dr. Jonathan, thank you. How are you?
Thanks for having me. This is pretty excited to be here.
Awesome, awesome. So, Dr. Jonathan has also a unique experience here that I wanted to bring to the podcast because, as trained veterinarian, you went to University of Pennsylvania, I believe, right? You worked at a couple of hospitals, and you've sort of shifted a little bit your focus to the technology side of things, AI. You're now working with Mars Veterinary Health. I would love for our audience to know a little bit more about your story, that transition from an active a practitioner to more towards the role that you're doing right now.
So it's actually funny. I've always been kind of both technology and medicine. I come from a family of doctors and engineers, actually. And I
Yeah.
kind of got distracted along the way, as some people call it, with technology. And I went to Carnegie Mellon, where I did computation biology. There's not that many schools back then that actually had that combo, either computer science or biology. There was not as many that had it combined. Then, of
Yeah.
course, by the time I was a junior, there was like I think 20-fold more programs out there as everything came out.
Yeah.
And so I actually always wanted to be a vet before I could even write the word veterinarian, with the E backwards and all that fun stuff. I've always enjoyed that type of experience of wanting to be a vet. But towards the end of college, getting to vet school is really hard, right? It's harder than med school, things like that. And people in the year above me did not get it. Did not pass go, did not collect $200, no island schools, no anywhere. No one took them. And, hindsight 2020, you learn about the selection process, how it's different. But I was like, well, since I've always liked computers, let's see what I can do. And I figured out that masters and PhD students have a 30% higher likelihood of getting in
Yeah.
to veterinary school than a bachelor's.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay. And, they didn't offer funding for masters, and I knew vet school was very expensive. So I wound up with a PhD in biomedical informatics. And that's actually how, so
Wow.
and that is when I learned about applying medicine and computers and AI and machine learning. Back then, AI wasn't the buzzword; it was all machine learning because you didn't want to be saying your system was too smart.
Right.
There wasn't as much acceptance back then.
Yeah.
But that's actually so. I've always wanted to merge it, and then PennVet through the Inspiration Award and the people I worked with and some of my mentors really allowed me to learn how do you fuse it. But there wasn't a lot of people doing it, or the people who are doing it were siloed or very specific or niche. And Association for Veterinary Informatics was around, but it was a small organization. We're now over like 400 people in like 15 countries. So
Wow.
a lot of us are around who are in the industry or who are excited by technology. But it's actually I've always wanted to do, but I had to learn how to be a vet. One thing I learned from all my years at Pitt Biomedical Informatics is that oftentimes the people with the most success who have the least, let's say, resistance in adoption or resistance in explanation, people who understood a workflow, which makes sense. You're more listening to someone who knows what you've gone through than someone who doesn't, just human
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
And so I actually had fantastic mentors. I got to do a rotating internship and business internship concurrently at Red Bank Veterinary Hospital. I
Yeah.
got to do even a business fellowship. So I understand about building, we started new departments. We added new equipment. We understand how to use the data for diagnostic and protocol development. So it was a really rich and wonderful experience under Dr. Anthony DiCarlo. And then Compassion First became an entity and acquired Red Bank. So I actually got to work under people like John Payne and Dr. John Crisal to learn about their processes. So I was actually it's a stepwise journey, but I was always looking at how do I merge the two. But I
Yeah.
had to learn how to be a good doctor, and I had to learn from some of the best doctors in the world first
Yeah.
in order to be able to say, okay, how do I apply technology while getting out of their way? I mean, they're fantastic doctors. Less time they are not treating patients. The more time they're not treating patients, the worse off patients are.
Yeah.
And if I'm not going to see patients every single day,
Yeah.
I better make sure what I do makes everyone's life easier. So that way, all the patients they see, I've helped too. And I've always wanted to do that. So I always keep that promise. If I'm not helping more patients in a year than I can see, I should not be doing it. So that's like a minimum level.
Wow, that's beautiful. I really like how you put that. I really like how you put it. It shows the commitment towards improving the industry as a whole and the compassion for the patient, for the pet. So it's very similar to the mission that we had here also at Vetric on making sure that the veterinarians focused on the pet, right? So that's beautiful. And how did you end up in Mars Veterinary Health?
So yeah, so I was with that and I was working on it, and one of the product director that I work with now, Dr. Des Balance, he and I met through Association for Veterinary Informatics, and we've always wanted to work together. It's like it's not that large of an industry, so it's like knowing really awesome people like that, and what he does. He's like, hey, John, we have something that we're working on. We'd like you to come in. And, my application of being able to extract information from data, being able to create applied projects. So Dennis brought me in and to VCA, and that's actually where I started. I was working on supposed to be AI, machine learning, informatics type approaches in the system. And then, Mars Veterinary Health acquired VCA and became integrated everything together. And they started this giant project called Voyager. And what it is, it's a platform that is supposed to connect all of Mars Veterinary Health together to provide substantial and better data and just better integration, just future looking technologies. Okay. And so I was like, okay, sure. And I was really excited. I was really lucky, to be honest, to be able to, from working for Compassion First with fantastic people and having people like Dennis introduce me to the fantastic people at Mars Veterinary Health. Like, I was really lucky that I've been able to find such great people who have like opened up doors or who I've been able to talk to keep exploring that facet. But man, it is such a new world that I'm working in now, and just building a system from scratch with all the things that all of us know from all the current systems. What doesn't work? What does work? Yeah. What would we like to see more? And then on the backside, which is where a lot of my focus is today, how do I make sure the information that we store can be fed back to the doctor to be more efficient and more effective, as well as fed back, as well as used downstream for all sorts of improvement in patient health, in AI systems to improve doctor efficiency, doctor effectiveness, doctor burnout, like reduce time for record, all those things. But it has to deal with the data, and the veterinary industry suffers from the lack of an 80% of all revenue single payer in human medicine, right, which is the U.S. government. And so they say, I want all data to be the structure. That's the way it's going to be. They have, whoever the money makes the rule, right? Yeah. We don't have such a strong integration, and there are people working on it. But those standards are really hard to implement ad hoc or per basis. But within Mars Veterinary Health, we actually are building systems that are built on standards and robust structures that everyone can share information, and we'll have to build it internationally. I mean, this is the same system that we use for international hospitals that Mars Veterinary Health owns. Nice. And so figuring out, okay, we have enough time figuring out what we call a disease using the same language. Now try to figure out in 17 other locale combinations. That's part of what I do regularly now. And luckily I work with people who are much, much smarter than me. I can figure out a lot of it. But it's, it's one of those challenges every day that you wake up, you're like, there's not a lack of things to do today. That is for sure.
Same here. Don't worry. Yes. I completely feel you. And we were chatting just briefly before the podcast that I brought in Dr. Emil, who also works at Mars. I was also a doctor, and also now is focusing on artificial intelligence and engineering. And that you mentioned that you know him. I had asked him, and I wanted to ask you, how's the I guess you work with a lot of doctors as well in Mars Veterinary Health. How's the general, I guess, because in this front-facing AI technology, there might be more willingness to adopt it and use it, but have you seen skepticism, pushback from traditional, maybe older doctors or younger doctors that you work with, or is it mainly the people that you work with from a doctor's point of view, not from an engineering point of view, who always likes to do the groundbreaking next LLM things? Like, from a doctor's point of view, have you seen a little bit of that pushback, that skepticism on this new front, or no?
Yes and no. It just depends upon what you're talking about and how it is. There's, need, desire, time, money, and payer, right? Who's paying for it? Those are three factors that can be quite in tension. And so I think they're, going back to human medicine, when a lot of the AI was being built, that led to like the winter of AI in human medicine for a decade. There wasn't as much common systems, intelligent search. You have, GPT-4, Gemini. You have all these systems now. People's smartphones. Apple's integrating GPT in iPhone 16, right? All those types of things. Yep. That didn't exist back when human medicine was doing this. And so I think fundamentally we're dealing with a different environment. I do think the what's happening is that the pace of innovation is outstripping the knowledge bases of most standard practices in terms of what technology is, what does it actually do. And there's a lot of marketing, and big companies are marketing such tremendous things, and you hear things like, oh, this test passed a medical exam, right?
Yeah.
That's nothing to sniff at. But it's also very different when you have structured answers, right? You pick A, B, C, D, and it has a very large memory, more memory bank than a human generally can have,
Yeah.
right? And recall, but it's right. It has all that, and it can answer that. Versus here's a patient where it could be anything you've ever seen, and probably 1,000 things that you haven't seen yet, too, right? And you have to figure out. That's a very different scenario, and so there's a little bit of a roller coaster I'm starting to see where people are, oh, this is so exciting. Oh, that doesn't do what I think it is. Oh, it's so exciting. Oh, it doesn't do what I think it is. And some of that is due to the technology. Some is due to the product itself. Some is due to the way it's implemented. So it's what I found is that there's more of willingness to try because we all kind of acknowledge things can't stay the same. But I also think there is also a push-pull on that because all of a sudden when they start using it, oh, I didn't realize it did that. Oh, I didn't realize I had to do it in this case. There's a little bit of application and guidance that a lot of individuals may not have or be given on it. Human medicine for I think almost 10 years now requires maybe a little less, but around 10 years requires all doctors to get exposed to informatics, biomedical informatics, to exposed to what it means to do machine learning, what it means for the data systems, mainly because their EMR is so informatics heavy.
Right.
They have to. It's their day-to-day life. Veterinary schools do none of that. Now, there are some schools that have elective courses. They have some schools that have foci. It's not that some schools don't have it, but there is no requirement nationally.
There's no
So all that, and then of course the age gap. Even if they started today, you still have what 90%, 100% of the workforce. If you start today, 100% of the workforce does not have that. And so those are all the things that kind of tie into the resistance or hesitation or trepidation. The other side is marketing. There's a lot of companies out there that are publishing marketing things without necessarily showing where it doesn't work. So a great example is there's a lot of voice to dictation software out there, right? There's diagnostic biomarkers, predictive algorithms. Great. What is the rate of failure? I do a diagnostic test. I may not look it up to be here if I'm doing it, right? But it's there. It's published. I can see it. I can see how false positive, how many things. I get a feel for it. And a lot of the stuff has been out there for at least a couple of years. So you have your colleagues doing this new stuff. You don't know how often or how much introspection you have to look. And so you get the surprise effect. It's it's right. All of a sudden it's wrong. And wait, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that result. And that was always a risk. You just happen to have you flipped a coin and you got 3 heads. And then all of a sudden it actually tails came up. I'm not saying technology is that bad.
No, of course.
But then language models make it even worse because they're so confident. And they say things that have what's called factual hallucinations.
I wanted to get into that.
Be true. It's not a truly made up because they have some source, but there's really not a support in what was said or what they read to give you that answer. And those are really subtle because you may be thinking it in your head. And what is the presentation bias, right? And self-certainty and certainty bias, right? If something that is presented to me that I think is true, I'm not going to call into question because my consistency, right?
And also the conviction into how that's said or how that's
presented.
Because if you talk to somebody and they're convinced that what they're saying is true, even though it's not true, your brain is like, well, I think they might be right, and it's not true. So I actually wanted to, because we were nearing the end of the podcast, Dr. Jonathan, I think that we can talk for an hour here. This is amazing. I wanted to touch on that, the hallucination side of things, because you wrote an article, and I'm going to publish it again on whenever I publish this podcast so that more people can see it and augment your reach. But you do define very well, what a hallucination is, this term that has, existed for a long time, but now has been more active with large language models and what it means for the large language models to hallucinate. And I'm looking at it right now. And so you correctly, you're describing what a hallucination is, but also separating into different categories. So what's factually correct, what's factually incorrect, some contradictions, or, a vague answer sort of thing. And so I think with large language models, to your point, the education has to be very, very important into what you can expect from it. And also, like understand that, large language models are probabilistic models, right? Like it's predicting what the next token is, right? And I'm not going to explain this right now. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you in terms of this article that you wrote on the different hallucination types, and what are you seeing with that front?
Yeah, I go back to, if I say the cat in the, right, eye contacts, most people say hat. Well, if you're exposed to Dr. Seuss, right? If you're not exposed to Dr. Seuss, you're not going to say hat, right?
Yeah.
It's whatever location you're coming from.
Yeah.
And however, but if I'm talking about a shelter, it could be cat in a shelter, cat in a carrier, cat in the box outside, and you don't know, right? So that's the problem with the rare token. But the reason why I started this, and I have a couple more articles coming out,
awesome.
is that even for my own benefit, how do I evaluate the technology that either I'm building or I'm integrating with? I'll build it if I don't have it. If it already exists, I'll use it, right? And the thing is, like, we don't even have guides, right? It's, sensitivity, specificity. A test is right or wrong. But what about subtlety? What about semantic closeness, right? If I had severe vomiting, and I just said vomiting, is that the same thing? Well, you could get into arguments, but the problem is, if we can't decide, how the heck are we going to have a machine do it, right? Yeah. But I guarantee you, if we call it vomiting and Mars says severe vomiting, or vice versa, that may be harder to catch.
Yeah.
And so we have to, my goal was defining, okay, here's our problems. Like, here's some common problems, and then work through how do we start catching it, because these language models are really useful for bulk activities, for a lot of generation, things like that. But we need to understand that if you're going to use it for a medical purpose, you need to understand when it's going to be wrong. But first, we have to understand how can it be wrong.
Yeah.
And that was my goal. Is like, start with the how, see what people think, see where I miss it, because I'm this not published out there. And then work our way through and saying, okay, how do we have systems? And does it matter if it gives a vague answer, right?
Yeah.
Is that a bad thing? If it gives a possibly semantically correct answer but not fully supported by the text, is that a bad thing? Like, but these are conversations I can't decide myself. But
of course.
Right?
Of course. And to that point, to conclude, what is your advice or recommendation that you can tell somebody that wants to learn about these things and does not know what an LLM is, right? Like, how do you even get started here?
So irony, the fun thing is you can actually ask the LLM itself. So laugh, it actually does a decent job. Now, I wouldn't say it's quite robust, but it does a decent job. Yeah. There are things like Perplexity and Bing that allow use AI to help augment search, right? There's stuff on LinkedIn, which, I'm one of many people that publish. You have to be careful. There are a lot of, people publish for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But like everything, skepticism. But it really starts with, I always say, if you want to know an LLM, what do you want to know? Like, knowing about an LLM is great. It's like, it's knowing about particle physics. That's really cool. I'm never going to practice particle physics. So for me, unless you're building it or implementing it, a lot of times is, what are things to watch for in whatever product I'm using? And it could be anything. I don't care if it's a predictive AI or a generative AI. It does not matter. Yeah. What are you looking to do? And what are your sensitivities? So in one of my lectures I gave, I called it the VERA, the Veterinary Informatics Risk Assessment. Yeah. And you basically have to decide, it's a relative score, but it's fundamentally saying, whatever I'm using this for, whatever I'm learning about, what is important that I get, right? Mm. And then you say, okay, let's say it gets it right. How do I know? Yeah. And then say, if it's not going to get it right, what does it look like? What does not getting it right mean? And unfortunately, generative text is literally like, how do we know when someone's written a really good paper? Most people say, you'll know it when you see it. That's great, but you can't build the operations about when you know it, when you'll see it, right? So you have to figure out, okay, when something happens, how do I handle it? How big of a deal is it? If it's a little bit vague and my doctors are reading every lecture, it may not matter. Yeah. But if it gets it wrong or makes it too broad or too overstating, and that's a big deal to me, then I say, okay, how do I mitigate it? Can I mitigate it? Yeah. And oftentimes the answer is you have to go back to whatever vendor or whoever's developing it, for the AI developed for Mars Veterinary Health, they come back to me, but they'd say, how do we prevent this? Yeah. Right? And then you have to decide. It's like using a diagnostic test. If I know that this diagnostic test has a very high sensitivity, but very low specificity, right? I have to say, okay, I use it, right, for spin and snout, right, snout to rule out. If it calls it negative, I'm going to be okay, right? But if it calls it positive, I'm going to have to be careful, right? So I can't trust it. So these are the types of questions. The same thing with the you have to kind of understand when it gets it wrong or what you think wrong is.
What is the
What you want to accept it, and
what
often
the expectation is? Yeah.
and then start with that and figure out. Okay, go to the vendor, read online. There's actually a lot of I love the For Dummies book. You know, the yellow For Dummies book. And people make fun of it, but honestly, the writing is really, really crisp in that. And then
I read a couple of those when I was little to learn how to program in script. And
but you can actually use LLMs to help digest some of these articles too, right? You can actually help them. They're not great. Again, be careful about it. Summarizing. But if you're looking to break it down to simpler concepts, you can use that. You can talk to people. You reach out to me, reach out to you, reach out to Neil, all these people to help. But it's honestly, you have to start with what is good and what is not good for me when I use this, whatever. And don't try to worry about the technology beneath, because even the inventors don't know how all that works. Like they know how the mechanisms are, but they don't know why the output is exactly the way it is. But they don't know right now. So,
no, and learning by trying, right? Which is what you're saying as well. Yeah. This was awesome, Dr. Jonathan. What a way to conclude it. Thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it. And until next time, okay?
Likewise. Have a good day. Thank you so much.